Good afternoon, little friends. Today was a great day to go out visiting. We got to see so many neighbors outside. It was a little bit warmer than usual. So I'm going to read 2 books about being neighbors. First, I'm going to shut the door. The first book is called The Lil Mailman of Bayberry Lane. This is written by Ian Munn and illustrated by Elizabeth Webb. Try to make sure the light is better. And it looks like it was printed and copyrighted. It doesn't say, but it's very old. It's falling apart. Okay. It was a lovely, clear autumn afternoon. You see those? Okay. It was a lovely, clear autumn morning, in Bayberry Lane. The trees were bright yellow and red, and the thistles were sparkling in the dew, and there was that good bayberry smell coming from the bushes on either side of the lane. Even though it was very early, Mrs. Goose had wandered up the lane picking bayberries. She was going to make bayberry candles that day. Besides, she always liked to be the first to welcome the little mailman, for he always had the latest news. She peered up the lane to see if he was in sight. Mrs. Duck was sweeping the yellow leaves off her walk. She too kept going out to her mailbox and looking up the lane. I do hope that there's a letter from my sister, she thought. Then, from up the lane, came the little mailman, chattering. "Ah, Mrs. Goose, you're out early this morning. Here's your mail. Have you heard that the robins are going south for winter?" And Mrs. Duck, "A yellow letter for you today. Yellow means good news, you know." He put a tulip catalog into Mr. Turtle's mailbox and called, "Hi, Mr. Turtle. Here are 2 lips for you that won't talk back. Ha ha ha." Mr. Turtle was sitting on his front step in the warm sunshine. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. He was listening for the cheery whistle of the little mailman. "I wonder if he'll bring my new tulip catalog," he thought. But he didn't go out to the gate and look up the lane. "Shucks," he said, "what's the hurry?" Well, this is what happens. I think that page fell out, but actually, I guess he just, yeah. I think this page may have fallen out and gotten out of order. Around the bend in the lane was Mrs. Pig's house. Mrs. Pig was waiting by her mailbox, even though she never received any letters. Every morning she hoped for one, but every morning the little mailman passed her by. And as quickly as he had come, he was around the bend in the lane. And there was Mrs. Pig standing by her mailbox waiting for him. The little mailman put on a bright smile and called, "Good morning, Mrs. Pig. Say, do I smell apple tarts this morning?" "I have one here for you," said Mrs. Pig. "Today's my baking day, you know." He bit into the tart. Mrs. Pig, you are the best cook on Bayberry Lane." I wonder why Mrs. Pig never gets any letters. Maybe it's because she never writes any herself. I wonder why she doesn't have any friends. Maybe it's because she never goes out anywhere to make friends. Maybe she's shy and afraid to try. Somebody ought to get her started. He was still munching on the apple tart. He said. "Today is Friday. I wonder what she'll bake next Friday." Then he had a wonderful idea. "Wonderful!" he shouted, and he couldn't wait to get home to start working on it. The little mailman's house was under a stone wall, so it was always dark in his rooms, even in the middle of the day. He lighted one of Mrs. Goose's bayberry candles and sat down at his table to write. He wrote, "You are invited to a surprise party for Mrs. Pig next Friday afternoon at 3. Then he popped the invitation into a pink envelope for Mr. and Mrs. Goose, then another for the ducks, and one for Mr. Turtle. The next morning, the little mailman had passed through Bayberry Lane, and all was excitement. Everyone but Mrs. Pig had received a pink invitation. There hadn't been a party in the lane for such a long time. Mrs. Goose was ironing her party sash. Mrs. Duck was sticking feathers into her party hat. And Mr. Turtle was shaking the mothballs out of his party jacket. But Mrs. Pig was still sad and lonesome as she went about her housework. On Friday she did her baking as usual. This time she made apple tarts and little lemon cakes, all covered with hickory nuts. She set them on the windowsill to cool and went to work in the garden. At 3 o'clock, she was just picking a bouquet of chrysanthemums when she heard, "Surprise! Surprise!" and up popped 6 heads from her garden wall. She dropped the flowers and dropped the scissors and stood there with her mouth open. She could hardly believe her eyes. Then she remembered her manners and said, "Oh, do come in, won't you?" They all scrambled over the stone wall except Mr. Turtle, who went around and through the gate. Mrs. Goose said, "I've brought you one of my bayberry candles. They smell so good when they're burning." Mrs. Duck said, "I've brought you a feather duster I made myself." The little mailman had brought her a basket of hickory nuts, and just then Mr. Turtle arrived and presented her with one of his best tulip bulbs. It was the happiest afternoon in Mrs. Pig's life. Everyone had a wonderful time at the party. They played croquet on the lawn. Mrs. Pig brewed a big pot of tea and served her apple tarts and lemon cakes. The party didn't end until dark. The following day, the little mailman chatted with everyone as usual all up and down Bayberry Lane. And as he came to Mrs. Pig's house, he whistled a merry tune, for in his mail bag were 6 thank you letters for Mrs. Pig. Mrs. Pig was so excited that she read them right where she stood. And Mrs. Pig was never sad and lonely after that. There were many visits to be made, and so many parties, and so many letters to be answered, and then Mrs. Pig knew that she owed all her newfound happiness to her very best friend, the little mailman of Bayberry Lane. That's such a nice little book. I heard this morning about children who were taking sidewalk chalk and drawing pictures for their neighbors, either nice notes at the end of their own streets and sidewalks that said, "We love you, neighbors," or sometimes a little bit of art, just a little bit in front of somebody else's house, just to cheer them up, so that maybe someone who doesn't get out of the house very much could see from their house. I think that's a nice idea. I'm going to turn the camera around to try to catch some more of the day's sunlight. And I'm going to read another book about a neighbor that went just a little bit too far. A neighbor that went just a little bit too far. So we have to know that there are boundaries to how much that we can do when it comes to visiting a neighbor or being neighborly. This is called Peter Rabbit. This is a traditional story. This particular version was made in 1961, and the illustrations are by Carl and Mary Haig. which sounds like a lot of fun. This was a book that says is from Great Aunt Minnie to Uncle Bruce, which is kind of nice. So this is one of Uncle Bruce's books. That last one was one of Great Aunt Becky's books when she was little. And Uncle Bruce loved that book. That's one of his most favorite, if I say. What's one of your favorite books to have read to the kids when they were little? It was The Little Mailman of Bayberry Lane. Such a happy little story. Okay. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits called Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. One day, Mrs. Rabbit said to them, "Today you may go into the woods and pick berries." The rabbits all scurried to tie their shoes and put on their hats and to look for their blackberry pails. Soon they were on their way, and remember, called Mrs. Rabbit, not to go near old Mr. McGregor's garden. Then she tied on her bonnet and hurried off to market to buy brown bread and buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, good little rabbits, began to fill their pails with wild berries, but Peter, a naughty little rabbit, went directly to Mr. McGregor's garden. He had never seen so many beautiful vegetables. He ate carrots and radishes, French beans, and then, not feeling well, he looked for some parsley. But as he was nibbling at the parsley, he heard the squitch-scratch, scritch-scratch sound of Mr. McGregor's hoe. Peter was so frightened that he jumped, and then Mr. McGregor was after him, waving his hoe and shouting, "Stop, thief!" Peter ran through the rows of vegetables so fast that he lost his shoes, one among the potatoes and one in the cabbages. He looked over his shoulder, and Mr. McGregor was running close behind him, waving his hoe as he ran. Peter might have gotten away if he had not caught the buttons of his jacket in a gooseberry net. It was a blue jacket with pretty brass buttons and quite new. Peter began to cry. 2 friendly sparrows heard him and begged him to hurry away. Mr. McGregor was ready to pop a sieve over Peter's head when he finally pulled his paws out of his sleeves and scurried away between the 2 rows of lettuce. He ran into the tool shed with Mr. McGregor close behind. Peter jumped into a watering can. What a perfect place to hide! Mr. McGregor began to overturn flower pots, thinking that Peter might be hiding under one of them. He looked and looked. Poor Peter jumped into a watering can that was just half full of water. Just as Mr. McGregor was about to go back to his hoeing, Peter sneezed, "Kerchoo," and then Mr. McGregor was after him again. Up and down among the rows they ran. Finally, Mr. McGregor had to give up, and so he went back to his onions. Peter looked around and he saw a hole in a door. He saw a door in a stone wall. He tried to squeeze under it, but he had eaten too many carrots and radishes and French beans, and there wasn't enough room for a fat little rabbit. Peter sat down and began to cry. A mouse came by who was gathering vegetables for her family. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had a large pea in her mouth, and she couldn't answer his question. Peter looked around. He saw a white cat watching a goldfish in a pond. He heard about cats from his cousin Benjamin, so he passed by without speaking. Then, quite near, Peter heard that scritch-scratch, scritch-scratch sound of he hid behind a large cabbage, but presently, as nothing happened, he jumped up on a wheelbarrow and peeked over the side. There was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions, and beyond him was the gate. Peter ran for the gate and squeezed underneath it, and didn't stop running till he was deep in the woods. Old Mr. McGregor hung up Peter's little jacket and shoes as a scarecrow to frighten away the birds. Peter never stopped running till he got to his cozy home under the tree. He was so tired he flopped in a heap at the foot of the stairs and fell fast asleep. Mrs. Rabbit was busy in the kitchen. She looked at Peter and wondered what happened to his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes he had lost that week. Peter didn't feel very well that evening, so Mother Rabbit tucked him into bed just a little bit early. She made some chamomile tea and gave a spoonful to poor Peter. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had fresh bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. So you shouldn't go into neighbors' yards and take things. That's not really good. But I guess Peter just didn't know what he was getting into. One time when I was a little girl, my neighbor used to throw peanuts out for the squirrels. And when I was a child, they used to have, just like an Easter egg hunt, they would also have a peanut scramble. Sometimes people would throw bags and bags of peanuts into a big field, and whoever got the most peanuts would win. So sometimes when he threw the nuts out for the squirrels, I would go and try to gather them up, which meant I sneaked into the gate, which was kind of silly because my neighbor was right in the kitchen watching me the whole time. He was a nice man. He wasn't like Mr. McGregor. He came out and asked me if I wanted some peanuts. After that, I sort of knew that I had been doing something wrong because you don't have to sneak around if you are not doing something wrong. So I realized because I was sneaking, I shouldn't have been doing it. But his niceness in offering me the thing that I wanted almost made me feel more sad about having done something sort of wrong. Anyway, so I think today's idea, or maybe tomorrow if you're listening to this late in the day, that if the weather's nice, maybe make a nice picture out front of your house to cheer up your neighbors. Or if there's an older neighbor that especially likes you but you can't visit them right now, or a grandparent, you can you can draw something for them maybe out front of their house if it's okay with them. And also, maybe Mom and Dad can take a picture of it and send it to someone. All right, have a good day. It was really nice for Aunt Becky to be able to visit with you this evening.